Imagine you're in a job interview for a role at Salesforce and the interviewer asks, "What is an Apex trigger?" Now, you might be wondering the same. An Apex trigger is essentially a piece of code in Salesforce that springs into action before or after a record is inserted, updated, or deleted. This is no ordinary code. It's a powerful tool that can automate complex business processes, enforce rules, and even manipulate data in Salesforce. Think of it like a superhero, always ready to leap into action when needed. Whether it's to ensure data integrity, streamline workflows, or carry out custom actions, Apex triggers are the go-to solution for developers. But why are these triggers so important? Simply put, they allow developers to go beyond the standard functionality of Salesforce, creating custom solutions tailored to unique business needs. So remember, understanding Apex triggers is key to mastering Salesforce development. Now let's dive deeper. What happens when an Apex trigger fires multiple times in a single transaction? Well, it's quite an interesting process. In Salesforce, it's common for multiple operations to occur within a single transaction. This could be due to bulk operations, cascading triggers, or even recursive triggers. Now imagine an Apex trigger firing multiple times during this transaction. It might sound chaotic, but Salesforce has a way of managing this. When an Apex trigger fires multiple times in a single transaction, Salesforce maintains a single static context. This means that the values stored in static variables are retained across these multiple trigger invocations. The context is not reset until the entire transaction is complete. This is where the concept of bulk trigger operations comes into play. Salesforce is designed to handle bulk data operations. So, Apex triggers should be designed to efficiently work with multiple records at once. This way, they can handle the load of multiple operations within a single transaction. But there's a catch. Salesforce imposes governor limits to ensure no single Apex script or trigger monopolizes shared resources. These limits are in place to prevent any operation from hogging the system. It's a kind of checks and balances system that Salesforce uses to maintain performance and prevent system abuse. If an Apex trigger fires multiple times in a single transaction, and each trigger operation is not efficiently designed for bulk operations, it could quickly hit these governor limits. And when a governor limit is hit, the entire transaction is rolled back, not just the trigger operation. This can lead to data loss and inconsistencies. So it's crucial that your Apex triggers are designed to handle bulk operations. This means writing efficient code that operates on collections of records rather than individual records. It also means being mindful of governor limits and ensuring your triggers stay within these limits. Remember, an efficient Apex trigger should handle bulk operations and stay within governor limits. It's not just about getting the job done, it's about getting the job done efficiently and effectively within the Salesforce environment. So, you've got the basics, but what about the syntax? What does an Apex trigger look like? Let's dive right in. An Apex trigger begins with the trigger statement, which includes the trigger name, the subject it operates on, and the event that fires the trigger. It's like saying, "Hey Salesforce, whenever this event happens to this subject, I want you to do something." Next, we have the trigger events. These are the specific actions or conditions that spark the trigger into action. Think of it as the catalyst that sets the whole process in motion. These events could be anything from inserting a new record, updating an existing one, or even deleting a record. Lastly, we have trigger context variables. These allow us to access the records that fired the trigger. They are the bridge connecting the trigger event and the desired operation. And there you have it. That's the basic syntax of an Apex trigger. With the right syntax, you can create powerful Apex triggers. Ever wondered about the difference between before and after triggers in Salesforce? Well, buckle up because we're about to dive right into it. In a nutshell, before and after triggers are about timing. They denote when a particular action should take place in relation to a specific event. Before triggers execute just prior to a database operation, while after triggers execute immediately following a database operation. Sounds simple, right? But here's where it gets a little more intricate. Before triggers are primarily used to update or validate record values before they're saved to the database. So if you need to manipulate data within a record or perform a validation check prior to saving, a before trigger is your go-to. On the other hand, after triggers are used when you want to access field values that are set by the system, like a record's ID or last modified date, and to affect changes in other records. These triggers also come into play when you're working with read-only fields. After triggers allow you to perform operations that can't be done before a record is saved. The distinction between before and after triggers is crucial because it helps you decide which trigger to use based on the operations you intend to perform. For instance, if you're creating a trigger to update related records based on changes to a primary record, you'd use an after trigger, as the primary record's changes need to be committed to the database first. Conversely, if you were validating data on a record before it's saved, you'd use a before trigger. Understanding the difference between these triggers and knowing when to use each type can greatly enhance your Salesforce development skills. It's not just about writing code. It's about writing the right code at the right time. So there you have it. Before triggers for pre-saving operations and after triggers for post-saving operations. Remember, the key is in the timing and the type of operation you're performing. Knowing when to use before and after triggers can optimize your Salesforce development. So, you can write an Apex trigger, but how do you write a good one? This question leads us to the best practices in Apex trigger development, an essential segment in our journey of mastering Apex triggers. First and foremost, let's talk about using helper classes. Helper classes, also known as service classes, are used to house the business logic that your triggers require. This promotes code reusability and maintainability. It's always a good idea to have a single trigger per object and use a helper class to manage the logic. Moving on, let's touch on the topic of hard coding. As a general rule of thumb, hard coding should be avoided at all costs. Hard coding refers to embedding specific information directly into your code, such as IDs, which can cause issues when deploying the code to different environments. Instead, consider using custom settings or custom metadata types to store this kind of information. Next up is writing test classes. Testing is a crucial part of any coding process, including Apex triggers. Salesforce requires at least 75% of your Apex code to be covered by tests, and all triggers must have some amount of test coverage. These tests should not only cover positive scenarios, but also negative scenarios and bulk scenarios. Another best practice is to handle bulk data. Triggers are often used to handle multiple records at once. Therefore, it's essential to write triggers that can efficiently handle bulk data without hitting governor limits. Lastly, keep in mind the order of execution in Salesforce. Understanding this will help you avoid unnecessary recursion and make your trigger more efficient. In conclusion, writing a good Apex trigger involves more than just getting the syntax right. It's about organizing your code effectively, testing thoroughly, and handling data efficiently. Following best practices can ensure your Apex triggers are efficient, maintainable, and robust. So keep these tips in mind as you continue your journey of mastering Apex triggers. Ready for that job interview now? Let's go through some common Apex trigger interview questions. First off, you might be asked, what is a trigger in Salesforce? Your answer should be along the lines of, a trigger in Salesforce is a piece of code that gets executed before or after a record is inserted, updated, or deleted in the database. Next, you might face the question, how do you handle recursion in Apex triggers? You could respond by saying, to avoid recursion in Apex triggers, we can use a static Boolean variable. We set it to false initially, and when the trigger is called for the first time, the variable is set to true. For subsequent recursive calls, the trigger will not be executed because the static variable is true. You may also be asked, what is the order of execution in Salesforce? A well-rounded response would be, the order of execution in Salesforce starts with system validation to verify the data, followed by the execution of before triggers. After this, system validation occurs again, followed by the execution of after triggers and assignment rules. The order ends with post-commit logic, which includes sending emails and executing outbound message calls. Another probable question is, how do you test Apex triggers? You could answer, testing of Apex triggers is done using test classes in Salesforce. We need to ensure that the code meets at least 75% code coverage and successfully passes all the defined test cases. Lastly, you might be asked, what are best practices for writing Apex triggers? A good response would be, some best practices for writing Apex triggers include using bulkified code, using collections like list, set, or map to store data, and avoiding the use of hard-coded IDs. Also, it is advisable to use error handling mechanisms and write test classes for better code coverage. With these questions in your arsenal, you're well prepared for your sales.